Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope that each of you had a good break, and if a meal was part of that, that you enjoyed that also. I'm going to be guiding us in a few minutes of meditation practice, after which I'll introduce our afternoon speaker, Kalina, and also our discussant, who will be leading the Q&A period after Kalina's presentation, Wendy Hassenkamp. So please get yourself comfortable in your sitting position, whether on a chair or a cushion. Remembering that we endeavor to be relaxed, yet also upright, alert, awake. Bring your attention here in this moment. Whatever may have been going on just before we started, if possible, let that just fall away. For right now, nothing to do, nowhere to go. And allow your attention to drop into the body. Noticing the support of your chair or cushion. If you're on a chair, your feet on the floor. And be aware of that support and connection to the earth below that. Please take just a moment to recall your intention, why you're really here. And it may help in remembering that to call to mind someone or some being, doesn't have to be a human, whom you know is really suffering right now. See whether it's possible to picture that being in your mind's eye. And as you do that, convey to them that wish that they be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. That they be healthy, happy, safe. Allowing that image to dissolve, yet stay in the background. A way of allowing that to perfume the rest of this brief practice. And just letting attention, for right now, drop into the breath. Just riding each wave of the breath. The in-breath, the out-breath, and that brief pause before that next cycle of breathing. And if you notice that mind has wandered somewhere else, when you do notice that, no problem. Take note of it with friendly curiosity. What is this? Not in words, not in discursive thought, but just that noticing. And then gently and without judgment, allowing attention to come back to the breath and the body. If mind is busy, simply notice that also. Just staying present with whatever's there in your awareness. Just noticing, not engaging whatever's present in conversation and dialogue. Just noticing. In that noticing, see if it's possible to allow yourself to be aware of whatever's present. Sight, sound, feeling, thought, whatever it is, all of it, as just what is arising in mind. Not the things that any of those experiences seem to represent, simply arisings in mind. Notice sensations as just sensations. Feelings as just feelings. Thoughts, just thoughts. None of them my sensations, my feelings, my thoughts. Just arisings in mind. And again, if you discover at some point you've become lost in some recall of the past or imagining about the future, just what minds do. No problem there. Gently bringing your awareness again back into the present. Thank you for your practice. And it's my pleasure now to introduce Kalina Christoff from the University of British Columbia. I know from reading through the questions many of you submitted in the morning session, I was doing that during the break, that several questions concerned the bodily correlates, brain correlates, other bodily correlates of meta-awareness. That's an area that Kalina has distinguished herself in. Her experiments have been extraordinarily sophisticated and also illustrative of the way in which some of the relatively newly available technologies can really be helpful to us in this. So I'm very grateful that you're here with us today, Kalina. After your presentation, Wendy Hassenkamp from the Mind and Life Institute will be organizing our discussion, taking some questions, and also providing a brief summary at the end of that. So again, welcome, Kalina.
Thank you, Al, for this very kind introduction and for a wonderful guided meditation, which relates in many ways to what I wanted to talk to you about today, because much of the studies that I've engaged in over the years and a lot of the work that I'll tell you about today has been inspired by meditative practices, but also by I'm hearing some background noise, and I'm not sure if it's from my end. It's not.
Kalina, would you press the button on the lower right of your PowerPoint so that we see only the, yeah, that one. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So what I wanted to talk to you about today is this notion. The topic overall is the arising of conscious mental states and what we have learned about that from neuroscience. Data that might inform some of the discussions that we've already had this morning from philosophical and psychological perspectives. But what I wanted to open with is a notion that I came across several years ago about the view, or coming to the view. And this came from Milarepa, originally, 11th century Tibetan scholar. And he is rumored to have said that you can come to the view through meditation, or, sorry, my PowerPoint is not working very well. Okay, you can come to the view through meditation, or you can come to meditation through the view. I first came across this observation in a talk by Courtland Dahl, to whom I owe great gratitude for mentioning that, because I find it very insightful. He mentioned it during a conference which I attended 3 years ago, organized by Cliff Saran at Berkeley. And the conference specifically aimed to enhance and further advance the connection between Buddhism and science and put that dialogue on a new footing. And Court Dahl at that meeting mentioned that observation about a distinction between the view and how the various ways to arrive at it. And from that observation, I recently contacted him, asking him for more specific reference as to the sources of that. And he very kindly looked it up for me and discovered that since that attribution to Milarepa originally in the 11th century, it also occurs in the workings and writings of the 17th century Tibetan author Tsele Natsok Rinpoche, as well as more recently in an address that the Dalai Lama gave at the Kalachakra for World Peace and Grass. So it's an observation that appears to have occurred over the years, and what I wanted to do today is relate it and tell you how I interpreted it the first time I heard it, and how I find it inspiring for myself. It also relates very closely to the wonderful title for our symposium, which is formulated in terms of exploring the great landscape of awareness and what it is and how we arrive at it. And my relation to that observation that I showed you about the view is that the view is really that view of that great landscape of awareness that we're trying to understand. And it's a view because it's not a local presence, and it's an experience of something much bigger, just like what you can achieve if you go up to the mountaintop, but you couldn't achieve if you are embedded in the forest. And so for me, that view is that view of the landscape of awareness. And what I'd like to tell you is what we understand so far from work in neuroscience as to how awareness arises and what may form this quality of awareness that we subjectively could liken to a view from a mountaintop. A lot of the work that I'll mention today has been framed and inspired by a theoretical framework that a number of my colleagues and I, pictured here, published several years ago. And what we published is a paper that was trying to understand mind wandering from a broader theoretical perspective. So this is a view of mind wandering that is substantively different from the view that Jonathan Schuller has taken and that I have taken in the past. And I won't be focusing a lot on mind wandering today, but I'm happy to discuss that as we move along. What I want to focus on from that framework is what we were able to construct as a guess and as a theory as to how spontaneous thought in general and thought more broadly and consciousness even more broadly may be represented in terms of the dynamic interactions between different brain networks. So one of the most recent developments in neuroscience that I've been lucky to live through is that in the last 10 to 15 years, we have gradually and steadily moved from trying to understand what parts of the brain do to trying to identify global networks of the brain and how they interact with each other dynamically and what their functionality is. And I think this has been a very exciting development. And we took advantage of that development in trying to develop that theoretical framework. So I'll give you a very brief introduction into it. It will have some technical terms, but don't worry about following all of them. I will highlight the ones that are most relevant and explain them as best as I can. The name of the framework that we've put together is the dynamic framework of thought, referring back to its underlying brain dynamics. And what you see here is some of the most common networks of the brain that are most commonly discussed. And there are a lot of abbreviations, and I will unpack all of them as we go along. But what I want you to see here is that there's a number of squares, green squares here. So there are 4 + 2, 6. And each of these squares, in fact, represents a network of the brain. And on the next slide, I will show you what a network looks like. But what I want you to notice in this case is that what we're trying to do is take networks of the brain that are very spatially distributed. So they're not bottom up, top down, they're across the brain and they're interleaved with each other. And what we're doing is trying to understand how they communicate with each other in a structure. And so what you see here in the top is the FPCN, or the frontoparietal control network. And I'll show you that on the next slide. And what I'll take you through in the course of this talk is a little bit more about these interactions that we have been trying to understand, and I believe we understand at least to some extent at this point. What I want to give you is a little bit of an example, more sense as to what these networks look like and what they are. I want to begin with, focus on these 3 squares here, or 3 networks: the frontoparietal control network, the dorsal intentional network, and the DM core. So what are they? And what are networks in the brain in general? Well, this is an illustration of what these particular 3 networks are. So the FPCN stands for the frontoparietal control network. And you see it here in reddish color, indicated in different regions of the brain. You don't have to worry about the abbreviations around here, but what you do see is how widely distributed across the brain it is. Again, when I first started in neuroscience in the 90s, we used to try to understand what the prefrontal cortex does, or what the temporal lobe does, or what a particular part of the visual cortex does. And now what we understand is that the prefrontal cortex doesn't do anything by itself. Instead, what it does is it connects to very specific, highly interconnected to regions throughout the rest of the cortex. And that is what the frontoparietal control network is. The reason why it appeared on the top of the previous slide is because this is the network that has been linked most extensively to what psychologists and neuroscientists refer to as cognitive control. it is also something that I have linked through my work, and other people have linked through their work to meta-awareness and awareness more generally, but it's quite specialized for meta-awareness, that high-level awareness that we're capable of implementing in our brains. So the other two networks I wanted to mention here, because I'll tell you a little bit about their interrelationship and how they might relate to the experience that arises in terms of external and internal type of sources of experience, are the core part of the default network on the left bottom here. And you would see that you may have already heard about the default network. It's become quite a famous thing to study in the last 20 or so years. And what has also happened more recently in the last 10 or so years is that we've also understood that in and of itself, the default network has at least 3 separate components to it that are distinguishable within it, but still belong to that network as a whole. And one of the most fundamental parts of that default network is called the core default network. And you see here the 2 regions indicated in blue. Again, I will not be telling you the abbreviations and what they stand for. They're very technical, Latin sounding words. But what you see is the medial part of the brain here. And that part of the core default network communicates with the FPCN in some very interesting ways that I want to tell you about. In addition, the third network that I want to tell you about is the dorsal attentional network. And as we go along, I'll give you a bit more information. So all of these networks, you see them now, how distributed they are. They mostly do not overlap with each other, but they are not in one place. And what defines a functional network of the brain is not its anatomical connectivity. So some of the regions within each network may be connected anatomically, but some of them are not, and in fact, most of them are not. What defines a functional network of the brain is the fact that the signal that we record from fMRI throughout the brain, when you look at these regions, the signal, it tends to go up and down in unison, in concert. So it's this functional correlation, not the anatomical connectivity per se, that makes us identify these networks. And so these are regions of the brain that tend to work together. And what we're, as I said, trying to do is identify the different functions, and above and beyond that, how these different networks interact with each other dynamically. One thing that we've done that's relevant to the discussion in the morning, and I'd like to potentially offer it as food for further discussion along that, is that together with 2 of my former graduate students, Matt Dixon and Kieran Fox, who are both very dedicated meditators and very much passionate about bringing in contemplative knowledge from contemplative practices into neuroscience, we put together a possible neuroscientific proposal as to how the brain, at the time we're interested in understanding the relationship between externally and internally directed cognition. Now, since then, I've come to like less the words external and internal when it comes to consciousness and cognition, but they're always tempting words to use, and we use them in the morning in our discussion. So what you see here is that there are these streams within the brain that we believe exist that connect what you might call in the red case on the left here, the stream, you may call that a sensory source of experience. So in this case, we've represented how the visual stream becomes connected to consciousness and then awareness and meta-awareness, going from the bottom to the top on the left in red boxes. And these are all different parts of the brain that connect to each other. And in this case, the black arrows, which are always bidirectional, are in fact anatomical connections. And the other thing that we've introduced ourselves, and this is something that I've been fascinated with, is that there appears to be a parallel stream which is not connected to sensory cortices. So just like the visual cortex connects up to the levels of awareness and meta-awareness, so does the auditory cortex, and so do the other sensory cortices. But what I've been trying to understand, and I've done a lot of work on, is trying to identify this stream, much more mysterious, that originates in non-sensory places of the brain. And what you see here is what we proposed and identified based on these neuroimaging data, as well as data from single cell recordings and so forth, including animal single cell recordings, is that there appears to be a parallel stream, and the two streams appear to converge at the top levels that originates with what I now call conceptual sources of experience as opposed to sensory sources of experience. And from our data and findings, it appears to originate from the mediotemporal lobe, so MTL at the bottom right here, the green box, stands for the mediotemporal lobe, which contains the hippocampus. And it appears to originate there and then propagate in some very interesting ways up in that stream that then elicits awareness and subsequently meta-awareness and converges with the other streams that do that for the sensory experiences as well. So this is a distinction that and a parallel stream that we were trying to identify, and we're also arguing for why a potential convergence at the higher levels may create some of these bottlenecks that we often struggle with as to how many things out of experience we can attend to at different points in time. So the way those two different streams can be translated then into what I showed you in terms of that dynamic framework is that the sensory sources of experience, not just the visual, but other sensory sources. And I'll qualify that as we go along. It's an interesting point of discussion, but let's just say that we're looking at the external sensory sources of experience, so the things that come from outside of our bodies, mostly vision and hearing in this case. They appear to have this very interesting stream, not just among brain regions, such as the previous slide showed, but among networks. So it appears that these signals, and it's not a linear process, it's a lot of amplification and a lot of back and forth and circuits of the brain, but there is a flow or of spread of activation and network connectivity that as it occurs, it appears to be able to elicit first awareness and then meta-awareness. So DAN here stands for the dorsal attentional network, and I will not be talking about that, but the idea is that there are different networks that appear to be handling the originating sources of experience when it comes to sensory, especially extrasensory perceptions. There's a special case here, and this is a footnote potentially for future discussion in the subsequent session, but I never know how to classify the interoceptive sensations, because on the one hand, they are sensory. On the other hand, they are internal. So if we go with the external internal, then we have to put together the interoception and the conceptual sources of experience together. But if we go with sensory versus conceptual, we should classify the interoception, things like the breath and your viscera, your stomach, your heart would be sensory. And there's, in fact, distinct networks and parts of the brain that handle the interoceptive sensations. And at this point, it hasn't been done, but I think moving in the future, that needs to be identified as potentially a third separate stream into the source of experience, as a source of experience. So bringing back to this network that I showed you, the conceptual sources of experience then map onto the right-hand side of this dynamic framework of thought and different networks that are that we have identified. So what's interesting around here? One interesting thing that I want to tell you about specifically refers to these conceptual sources of experience, or you can think of them as the internal sources of experience that are not interoceptive or viseroceptive or sensory. So what are these sources? This is what I have been just fascinated with since I was a little kid. You know, how do we come up with these mental states that are not fed by anything obvious in our perceptual world. And the more I study them, the more fascinated with them I become. And one of the things that we have discovered is that those different subcomponents of the default network, which you see in this case, illustrated here, all of these regions, the different colors correspond to the different subcomponents of the default network. And what we have discovered is that internal stream through which our conscious states arise, but they arise much before they become conscious, and I'll show you some evidence for that. They appear to begin in the mediotemporal lobe, and in fact, in that part of the default network that we now call the DNMTL, because it's centered around the mediotemporal lobe. So you see it in purple here. And crucially, it includes regions such as the hippocampal formation, as well as the parahippocampal cortex. And interestingly, the kinds of processes that are occurring there are not accessible to conscious awareness. And I'll show you the evidence for why we believe that's the case. There's two pieces of evidence that I'll tell you about that. And one of them comes from our lab. Melissa Ellamil was the graduate student who led that project that was done in collaboration with Evan Thompson as well. And what we did here was we took highly experienced mindfulness practitioners. So those were people who had had decades of meditation practice and tens of thousands of hours. And what we had them do is effectively what Al had us do the first 15 minutes right before my talk. We had them do focus on breath. And so they had to perform an open monitoring type of meditative practice in the scanner. But what we were really interested in is the moment of arising of any thoughts. So as you know, during that practice, oftentimes the practitioner is encouraged to note the occurrence of a spontaneously arising thought. And this is a skill that not many people have, and it takes some time to develop. For most of us, before any practice or without any proclivity for it, thoughts appear to occur continuously. They don't even have a break between them. So sometimes people say, well, how can you detect the occurrence of a thought when my thought just never stops? And the beauty of using practitioners here is that those were people who had a lot of skill in quieting down the mind so that they could detect the novel arisings. So what we had them do was simply press a button whenever they detected the arising of a thought. We also had them categorize those thoughts, but that's not something that I'll talk about in terms of analysis right now. What I want to show you is the difference, what happens in the brain in the seconds before the button press. And so this is really interesting because I didn't anticipate that we'll be able to see so much going on in the brain before the button press. But in fact, what we saw, and we specifically saw it in the hippocampus and the parahippocampus, so that mediotemporal lobe part of the default network. So this is the left and right hippocampus here, and the left and right hippocampus. What you see at 0 is the button press. So a person just detected the arising of a thought. Now what you see in these regions, 4 seconds prior to this button press, is activation relative to a time when they didn't have a thought. So typically, you might say, well, it takes a little bit of time to detect and to mobilize your motor responses to respond. But that's known to be about 300 milliseconds. So there's usually about a 300, maximum 500 milliseconds or half a second, a difference between you seeing a stimulus and you detecting a button, you pressing a button to say that you saw it. What's happening here is something that takes a span of almost 4 seconds, possibly more, before people even acquire the feeling of awareness that a thought has arisen. So what I've taken on calling that is that there is some kind of a spontaneous content generation, that it still takes a shape and form, and before it enters awareness, we can see it in the fMRI scanner. And I personally am always very skeptical of fMRI data. They're very noisy and our temporal resolution is not great. So I would not have believed our own data if it hadn't been preceded by a finding some years ago that you could also see the same thing with single cell recordings in the hippocampus and the entorhinal cortex, which is also part of the hippocampal formation. And what this group led by Gelbert Segev in Israel were able to see, this is in patients who have epilepsy. So they're implanted with electrodes in the hippocampus in order to examine their seizures prior to surgery. So what they were able to see in here is that during 3 recall of films and movie clips that they were showed previously, they were asked, just let your memory freely recall these and press a button whenever a memory arises. And so what they were able to see something very similar to what we saw, which was single cell activation. So the cells in the hippocampus and entorhinal cortex are firing up to 3 seconds in their case prior to the button press. So something's going on 3, possibly 4 seconds, but at least 3 seconds prior to awareness arising that then that precedes that awareness. And so I think this is very important for any theory of consciousness and awareness and how mental states arise, because it's not something that we have introspective access to. And it's very important that we inform and constrain our theories by virtue of what we know from what we can see in the brain. I will skip this slide in the interest of time, and I will tell you quickly here about specifically that conceptual sources of experience, how these conscious states arise sourced by those conceptual sources. One of the things that we very recently discovered and published is that, looking at that network that I showed you, looking at that schematic of how different networks relate, the frontoparietal control network, which seems to be at the apex of the hierarchy, and it seems to be this monolith thing, that monolith network, that's how it's been treated often by neuroscientists. What we discovered, very interestingly, that is by no means monolith, and in fact, it itself has 2 subcomponents, and we don't know what their full functionality is yet, so we just call them FPCN-A and FPCN-B, and what you were able to see on the previous slide is their distribution. So the blue and yellow here is overall the frontoparietal control network, which once again supports awareness and meta-awareness. But what we were then able to see was that the blue tends to be more interconnected, the blue regions more interconnected with each other, and the orange are more interconnected with each other. And that's just as a reminder here that default network in yellow and the dorsal attentional network. So going back to that dynamic framework of thought and how it's instantiated in the brain dynamics, what I wanted to mention, and as one of the last data points here, is that this frontoparietal control network, even though we may think of it as the bottleneck in our meta-awareness, in fact, is very flexible, and it can subdivide itself into these 2 components, A and B. And one marker of these components is that the component that we marked A tends to much more strongly integrate and correlate and work with that conceptual source of experience. Whereas the other component, the B component, appears to be much more integrated with the sensory, the dorsal attentional network, which then on its own turn integrates and correlates much more strongly with the sensory sources of experience stream. So even though it may look like we have this just one stream of thought and so forth, that's or frontoparietal control network that presumably at least partially implements that thought stream. And in fact, what's important to remember is that it's a very flexible basis for our thoughts, and it can be subdivided or united together. So we have access to these different mental states and different modes of functional processing that can either help us have a laser focus on a very small aspect of experience, but examine it very, very carefully, or it can broaden our focus of experience and our awareness of that experience in a way that does not allow us to focus precisely on any one aspect, but gives us that broadened view of our experience. So what I'd like to suggest here is these two top layers of that dynamic framework that I've been telling you about, that in fact correspond to what we are referring here as the great landscape of awareness. And my contribution to the discussion around meta-awareness is that meta-awareness, and this is very consistent with Jonathan Schuller's view from his Trends in Cognitive Science 2001 paper, meta-awareness is an optional state which you can implement at any point, but you can also unimplement at any point, so that you have this awareness, and a subset of the awareness can be dedicated to reflexivity within the awareness. So what happens within these networks here that I've highlighted in yellow is that the FPCN can implement meta-awareness. And my account of that is in large part informed by some of the studies that we've done, including in collaboration with Jonathan Schuller that he mentioned, where we examined the access of meta-awareness in the case of mind wandering in this case. But what happens with the frontal-parietal control network is that even though it can implement meta-awareness, it can also implement pure awareness. And this is very relevant, I think, to that idea of that great landscape of awareness, because my sense of the neuroscience is that that yellow box is limited as a resource. But then within it, if you implement meta-awareness, you take away some of the resources available for awareness, right? So, whereas if you don't implement meta-awareness, you have more resources available for awareness. And that is an interesting, potentially, point of discussion, because it could explain why we find richness in this great landscape. And why meta-awareness can have some detrimental effects that Jonathan Schuller has very ingeniously studied and demonstrated, but it can also have some very positive effects and enhancing effects if you have meta-awareness over a sensation that is pleasant or something that you would like to focus, such as, for example, a lot of the events that happen during mindfulness practice. In those cases, you can amplify, through meta-awareness, we amplify those experiences. And we take away some of our capacity to experience, but we amplify parts of them. And so if the amplification is towards aspects that are in some ways positive or in some ways desirable, I don't mean desirable in the sense of drive, I mean them in the sense of, even morally desirable. There's a power to that amplification. But if they're in some way negative or harmful, then there is a damage in such amplification. So that's my connection to the meta-awareness that we discussed. And the last point that I will make here is about our attempts most recently to bring into this framework and into our understanding of the mind and consciousness, the study of psychedelics. And so psychedelics, as many of you already know, it's a generic term for substances. They could be naturally occurring or pharmacologically generated that alter consciousness in some way or another. So the one of the very frequently studied psychedelics of recently has been psilocybin, which is naturally found in the psilocybe mushrooms, also known as magic mushrooms. But a lot of these psychedelics, specifically the ones that manipulate serotonin, and I want to say a few words about serotonin, are very interesting in terms of studying. And what you see here is, this is the dynamic framework of thought that I've been telling you about, which we recently tried to update in terms of how different mental phenomena may relate to each other in terms of these two different types of constraints that we've put together, which I will not discuss today, but I'm happy to discuss. I'll not discuss the talk, but I'm happy to discuss later discussion. What we try to do is relate the state that occurs under the influence of psychedelics to these other processes. And what we've pointed out recently is that it has a very close relationship to very spontaneous types of mental states that we often enter during phenomena such as nighttime dreaming, also some of the wilder mind-wandering episodes, as well as some of the more spontaneous creativity episodes. And the reason why I think psychedelics are interesting to our discussion today is because one of the things that we've tried to do most recently is look at how psychedelics can be used as an experimental methodology to examine questions around experience and self-experience in this case. And you can argue that all experience is self-experience. So that may be redundant in this title. But what we looked at is we examined what are the kinds of alterations in self-experience under psychedelics. And we observed alterations in bodily self-experiences as well as mental self-experiences. And one of the most interesting phenomena on psychedelics is something called ego dissolution. So consistently, people, especially on serotonergic psychedelics, report a dissolution of the sense of self. And that can be very positive or very negative, depending on the context. But it relates back to that topic that Jay talked about in terms of duality. And it's an experience that psychedelics can bring in which duality disappears. So that very compelling, as you say, Jay, illusion is dissolved. From my perspective, everything in the mind, of course, can be said to be an illusion. And you could also say that nothing is an illusion because there's a neural marker of what's going on. But to my mind, it's very clear that we have those two different ways of being in our brains and minds. One is a non-dual existence and one is a dual existence. And it's interesting that using psychedelics and potentially some meditative practices, you can induce these states relatively reliably. The final point I will make about psychedelics is that the reason why I'm interested in them is that in addition to getting to the view through meditation, I truly believe that there are other ways to get to that view, as I said yesterday. And it really is interesting to me to understand what kinds of ways people explore and experiment with. And one of those ways, to my understanding, is those serotonergic psychedelics, which have a very interesting effect on the brain. What they do, and what you see here, those two globes, is the difference in brain connectivity on placebo, so injection of sugar in your bloodstream or saline water, versus the injection of psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in psilocybin mushroom. What psilocybin does, very interestingly, is it activates very strongly a specific kind of serotonergic receptors. So it does in the brain what the release of serotonin in the brain will do. And what you see on these globes here, the colorful globes, on the periphery of the globes are the different brain regions. And they're colored differently if they belong to the same network. So the blue here is one network, probably the default network. This is another network, the yellow is a third network, red is a fourth network, and so forth. And those are the individual regions that belong to each network. And what you see is that this is the regular brain with no psychedelics. You have some connectivity, and there's some regularity of that connectivity. So the networks are much more connected within themselves than between themselves. That's a marker of the brain. That's in fact how we identify networks. Now what happens on the psilocybin is a lot more connectivity across networks. So what people are starting to realize and theorize now is that the effects of serotonergic transmission, when you can elicit it, be that through psilocybin or through activities that elicit serotonin, lead to a very interesting mode of functioning in the brain, which creates a lot more flexibility. So through this, negatively, you can call it a disintegration of the networks. You know, they're no longer integrated within themselves. But you can take a positive spin on that and say, well, now that the networks are no longer integrated within themselves, you have the potentiality of entering into new states that you didn't have before, because transitioning between one mental state to another and one mode of functioning to another is much easier in this hyper-connected state that is induced through psilocybin. But there are also some interesting parallels here to the kinds of mental states that mindfulness and other meditation practices may be inducing, which we are only now starting to understand. So what I'd like to leave you with, I don't have my clock has been blanked out here, so I'm going to assume that I only have a minute or two, and John, please correct me if I'm wrong. But I'd like to just bring it back to our topic for today and really raise the question of how do we examine that landscape of awareness? And it has been already really interesting to see the different approaches that you have seen today through the 3 different talks, including myself. We have the neurosciences, we have psychology, we have phenomenology, which is very powerful, but perhaps not sufficient based on what I've shown you today. And then we have philosophy and theoretical work. And I think given the mysteries of what's manifested in our experience and consciousness, I think it's really important and crucial that we combine all of them. And I thank very much the organizers for holding this symposium and for inviting me, because those are exactly the kinds of discussions that are necessary for us to further understand how consciousness arises. And finally, I want to acknowledge all of the people that did this work, all of my graduate students, postdocs, and undergraduate students on the top, and all of my collaborators at the bottom. And finally, I will say that Evan Thompson, who you see here at the bottom, emailed me yesterday and asked me to give to all of you his greetings and best wishes, and regrets that he couldn't attend this year. Thank you.
Kalina, thank you so much. So now, Wendy, I'm looking forward to you exploring with Kalina and also summarizing what Kalina has shared with us today, and then bringing in Richie and John and Jonathan, Alan, Jay, and to see also some of the questions that are coming up on the Q&A stream.
Thank you.
And it's beautiful to see you, by the way, Kalina, in our Zendo. We hope to see you there as not an illusion, but a semi-reality in the near future.
Thank you for making, thank you for making these images available. And Wendy, thank you so much for moderating the discussion.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much, Kalina, for that wonderful talk. It's really, that was very rich, and it's amazing to see what we are learning about the brain systems underlying all this. And you've been such a leader in this field, and helping to distinguish and really parse out these networks in ways that I don't think anyone else is really doing. So it's wonderful to hear from you, and thank you for all you've brought. I'll just start with a question from me. I think a lot of what we've covered in all the talks today relates to this difference between, or distinctions between the subjective and objective. Of course, objective, from Jay's talk, all of this can break down, and objective is always dependent on the subjective, but using at least the conventional terms, what you've shared is really bringing in the more objective kind of brain-based views of all of this. And then we have, of course, our own subjective experience of awareness, and a lot of the questions coming up in the Q&A are relating to this too, so we'll dig into it, I think, in a lot of different ways. But I'm just curious about how you view the relationship between the two. And obviously, you've done so much to advance neurophenomenology, an idea originally put forward by Francisco, to use subjective experience to inform our understanding of objective studies of the brain and the mind. Particularly, I love that study you shared about from the LML with the meditators indicating their awareness of thoughts. So there's clearly a lot of application and bringing in the subjective into understanding how our brains work. And I'm wondering about the other direction and what, I guess I could frame this in two ways. What's been your own experience of learning more about these networks and how the brain activity might underlie our experience in your own lived experience? Has that had an impact? And or where do you see kind of the future work and potential applications of this work and understanding these networks?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll address first the first question, and thank you, Wendy. Those are really good questions, both of them. I'll say the first question, it's probably easier to address, and any of you feel free to jump in and contradict me or correct me or ask me for further clarification on this. The relationship between the subjective and the objective, to me, they're not really possible to study in isolation. So almost all of the studies that we've done would use both measures. And this, of course, is the signature and the philosophy behind neurophenomenology, is that you would triangulate between the objective or the non-subjective ways of observing something and the subjective reports. And so the only reason why we were able to see something in the brain of these meditators in the LML study that they themselves couldn't report is because they reported what they could see. And so this was one of the novel elements in that study, was that until that study, we had mostly been assuming that people are having thoughts at some point. So we would scan, there was one or two other studies that we did before that, including one with Jonathan Schooler. But a lot of the assumption in neuroimaging has been and continues to be that if you just put someone in the fMRI scanner and have them do rest or do nothing, people never do nothing, of course, but just don't give them task, then people are thinking spontaneously. And one of the skepticism that I had was if that really is true and the case. And that skepticism has now turned into a certainty that people are not always thinking spontaneously. And this has been something that I've been very interested in. What is spontaneous thought? The assumption to begin with, when the default network was first identified, and largely still remains, is that not having a task equals spontaneous mentation or spontaneous thought. And this is something that we tried to do in that dynamic framework of thought, where we discussed how mind wandering is in fact a form of spontaneous thought. And this is a point where Jonathan Schooler and I do not necessarily agree on what is, we used to agree, but I think during my collaborations with Zach Irving, who is a former student of Evan Thompson, I have come to diverge away from that view of mind wandering as strictly task unrelated. So there's certainly a way in which the mind can wander off and become task unrelated or breath unrelated or whatever you're trying to do. So that's a sense in which the mind wanders off. But what I have become really fascinated with is the sense in which the mind wanders continuously in the absence of a task sometimes. And so that is something that I find a very interesting way in which the mind can wander. And so again, going back to the subjective and the objective, how do you study a spontaneous phenomenon, which by virtue of its spontaneity, as soon as you ask people to engage in it, is by definition no longer spontaneous? So it will be a nonsensical proposition to ask someone to please have a spontaneous thought now, which is what an experimental psychologist would want to do, to study something experimentally. So in the case of spontaneous phenomena, and that's why I'm really interested in spontaneity as a phenomenon in general, but spontaneous thought is a particular interest of mine, we actually have to develop some very novel methodology for studying them, because the standard scientific method of observation and experimentation being linked to control, obviously, is just futile in this case, because it eliminates the phenomenon from the point you try to control it. So what I believe we've made most inroads in is combining the observation, which will always and only subjectively come from the phenomenology, because the only access to the subjective consciousness is through the person themselves. So you always need that, and you need to combine it. It's helpful to combine it with some measure that gives you more than the subjective experience. So this is where I believe neuroscience can teach us. And I don't think neuroscience can teach us much in the absence of a subjective report. And I also don't believe that the subjective reports per se, or even simply the phenomenology per se, can teach us everything that we can learn about the human mind by simply observing it. Simply because when I put that yellow box on the top two layers of that framework that I showed you, what I also meant to indicate that actually what's below it is not part of the great landscape of awareness, right? This is just not accessible to our awareness. This is what we're starting to understand, and this is very new findings. And so because of that, there's more to the mind than what meets the inner eye. And so we need something more than phenomenology, but without phenomenology, we just cannot even get to that other more, because we don't know what the objective measure will be showing us. So I think the triangulation is the key word here. And in terms of my interests in this subject, I mean, I'll go back really, really back. I grew up in a faraway country of Bulgaria, which is in Eastern Europe. And I had a really peculiar experience in my childhood, which is that of wandering around for days at a time among the orchards of my grandparents' little town, the outskirts of it. And something about the experience of wandering around physical space really imprinted on me as a metaphor for the kind of changes our mind goes through. So this is why I really feel strongly that mind wandering, we should not shortchange it by simply thinking of it as going off task. Because sure, that's one of the ways in which mind wandering could occur, but that's a very, in a way, trivial way for it to occur. The much less trivial ways are when the mind wanders around our own mental space and explores the different conceptual places in our minds that are sometimes unexpected, and we get to them. And the way that exploring happens is very spontaneous. It's not deliberate. If we're deliberately guiding that exploration, it's no longer wandering. It's, goal-directed thinking. So this kind of process, I was really interested in, and I ended up studying. And what we understand now is that approximately a third to about a half of people's conscious states and thoughts tend to be freely moving in that sense, that they're neither directed intentionally, nor are they in some way drawn by something unintentional. And this is an interesting distinction that relates to what John Dunn was discussing, that what I've most recently started doing is try to explore the ways in which consciousness and thought stream can become constrained, not just by deliberate constraints that we put on it, but also by automatic influences. The word that I use for it is automatic, that can have a diverse range of sources that we don't necessarily understand. One relatively obvious automatic influence is emotional saliency. So if something is emotionally salient, the mind would tend to go to it. If your dog is sick at home and you have to go to work your mind will be going back to your dog because you care for your dog. And so these kind of concerns tend to draw the mind automatically, we know that. But what we don't understand is other ways in which the mind can be constrained, including through our contextual environments, including through our physical environments, including through our conversations. So this kind of conference that we would have ideally had in person would have been constrained in some automatic ways that we would not have been aware of or been able to orchestrate through our in-person interactions that we cannot access right now. So this is one of the the tragedies of the current circumstance is that in our communications, not just among ourselves here, but also among all of us, we are missing that richness that experience benefits from, that comes not just from our conscious and deliberate type of thinking, but also from all the kinds of constraints in which our thinking is determined. And this is a way in which I do agree with Jay in terms of the ways in which a lot of things present themselves to us without our deliberate intention or even understanding of how they arise in our minds. And they not only arise spontaneously, they're oftentimes constrained without our deliberate guiding, because of these automatic constraints that we don't completely understand, but are really important to look into.
Thank you. Jay, I wonder, since we were just touching, or she was just touching on parts of your talk, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Not very much, except to say that I just absolutely loved the talk and felt like I learned a great deal. It's always nice to see somebody working out how all that painting gets done, right? And I think that one of the things that I loved about the framework is, as you said, there's a lot that's part of the great landscape of awareness that we don't see just by looking. One of the real lessons that we learn, I think, from reflection in phenomenology, but in the Buddhist tradition as well, is just how deep the well springs of experience go and how far below the level of introspection they are. So, as you pointed out, introspection can be a really valuable experimental tool, but to treat it as a veridical source regarding what's going on in the mind is dangerous. And thank you very much for that, Kalina. I really enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the comment.
Jonathan, also wanted to give you an opportunity to respond. I know that you know, a lot of Kalina's work on meta-awareness overlaps with yours. You've worked together. She was bringing up some things that you may or may not agree upon. Did you want to chime in on anything?
Sure. First, let me also congratulate Kalina. That was really a scintillating talk, and a few of your papers that I missed. It was great to learn about them. We are sort of in the literature on it with a little bit of a disagreement about mind wandering, but really I think that the disagreement is quite superficial, in the sense that I completely agree that the term mind wandering can be used in a different, well, I agree that the idea of spontaneous thought and thinking about how our minds sort of move from topic to topic in an uncontrolled, free way is an absolutely fascinating topic, and does not require it to be task. It doesn't have to be that happens while you're engaged in a task. I think that routinely many of our most stimulating, creative, freely moving thought happen when we're just taking a walk and not really guiding our thought towards any activity. I would just, when I think about it, I would just call that a particular kind of mind wandering. That would be something like spontaneous, freely moving mind wandering or something like that. So I think it's important for us not to get hung up on definitional issues and really focus on the phenomena, which I think are really really fascinating. And I'm also intrigued by the way that she's now built in psychedelic states into that. I wonder, Kalina, in that graph that you had, where would you put, and I don't remember saying it, but if you were to put sort of the contemplative the state of the mind when, say, the contemplatives that you used were there, where would you put their thought in that graph, or their state of consciousness?
Well, that's a really good question. I would hesitate to put it to meditation anywhere in there, because meditation is so diverse and there's so many different practices. But you know, there's at least two practices that are very brilliantly identified, and a distinction that now is quite well accepted by Richie Davidson's group between open monitoring and focused meditation. They would fall in very different places. because focused meditation draws your attention and attempts to maintain it on one particular sensory object. And that is, as you now saw from the figures that I showed you, would first of all anticipate very different network recruitment, but it'll also look very differently in terms of constraints on thought, because during focused meditation, you're using the totality of your deliberate control to maintain that focus on one sensory item. And almost the opposite happens during open monitoring. So when considering where to put it in our conceptual space of different kinds of thought, they will be in very different potentially corners of that graph. Because in open monitoring, which is I think a fascinating mode of functioning, which I think my intuition about what's interesting about mind wandering actually in many ways coincides with what happens during open monitoring meditation. So during open monitoring meditation, you're simply observing any occurrence in the mind of any mental states. And an important component subsequent to the observation is that you let it go after it occurs. So you don't attach to it, which effectively means that you attempt not to elaborate on it in a way that creates a train of thought originating with that. So what happens in this state from neuroscientific perspective and from my perspective is very interesting, because I think that's where one of the benefits of this open monitoring meditation lies. And my understanding from meditative practices, and please, those of you who are Buddhist practitioners and scholars, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that the focused meditation is the stepping stone towards being able to then engage into the more complex practice of open monitoring as a skill. And so during open monitoring, because of this dual process of noticing anything, first of all, you cannot by definition narrow your attention. If you do, you won't notice what arises. You might notice a small subset of what arises. So you can't be waiting for something to occur. You have to be open, which what the name suggests. It's open monitoring, which also suggests that your attention is not focused. And that also suggests that you're not using your deliberative intention control processes in a standard way, right? You're using them in a very non-standard way, which I think is interesting. And so the subsequent then step of noticing it and then letting go of it is very important, because I think it actually creates a state of flexibility down the road. Because a lot of our thoughts, and this is what meditation is very well designed to help us deal with, have these automatic linkages between them, so that we get into these thought cycles and we get into these harmful connections of thought, in many cases converging onto the same type of concern or worry or so forth. And effectively what meditation does in this open monitoring context is deconditioning. And we wrote a chapter about that called the de-automization of thought, which basically it's almost what works like at the Pavlovian level, right? As if you have one mental state that tends to link to a second mental state on many occasions, and eventually to a third mental state. And that happens with regularity. If you can attenuate or even slow down the occurrence of the second mental state relative to the first, you're actually disconnecting the synaptic connectivity between these successive neuronal firings. And so what it creates is a very interesting potentiality here of then becoming more flexible. So you have more places you can go after that first mental state, if you've been able to some extent attenuate the connectivity to the second one. And I think that's a really interesting phenomenon, and a very relevant one to psychedelics, because psychedelic state and again, meditation, there's so many different kinds of meditations and there's so many different kinds of psychedelics, right? But there's some parallels here at the general level. And the parallels are that the psychedelic induced mind state is also becomes much more flexible. So from one mental state, now you can get to many more than you could before. And this is ultimately some of the positive side effects of an open monitoring practice as well. So this is the connection of my point that I was trying to shape around the fact that this view of flexible conscious experience that we can get to, and in many ways it's very beneficial, and in many ways it's very satisfying, and probably has a lot of health benefits to get to, can be gotten to through different means. And it's important to also compare those means, just like we want to compare neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy in terms of the approaches to the mind. So it's an interesting set of observations.
Thank you. There's clearly a lot. I can see links in everyone's talks about this idea of opening the, I guess what we could call aperture of awareness. A paper by John Dunn and others some years ago used this term of aperture, which I think is useful for the kinds of things we're discussing. And just bring in a question from the audience that relates to what you were just talking about, Kalina. This is from one of our participants in Brazil. So just speaking about how mind wandering is really relevant for mental health, and wondering about practices like awareness of mind or natural state, or these more open states versus the focused practices, and might one or the other be applicable in various, mental health concerns? Do you have thoughts about that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so the dynamic framework of thought theory that we put together specifically tried to look at the connections between mind wandering and mental health. So we specifically looked at what are the implications here for clinical conditions. And in fact, it was those implications and trying to understand how it relates that really forced me to think about the ways in which thought can become constrained in non-intentional, or what I call automatic ways. So I'll mention that connection to something like rumination, which is a form of depressive symptomatology. And it's something that practices like open monitoring and mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy can be very helpful because of that, the automation that they can do. And the crux of the issue that we argued with something like rumination, or even obsessive thoughts, it could be obsessive in a non-ruminative way, is exactly in that excessive automaticity, right? And so that, in fact, led me to rethink my own position on mind wandering very deeply, because up until that rethinking, I was convinced that rumination is simply a negatively valenced mind wandering, right? But the more I thought of it, the more I realized that no, that can be, because rumination is very fixated, and this is how clinically it is defined as a thought that is overly fixated on usually negative, but usually particular topics, and you have troubles moving away from it. While mind wandering is not, because it wanders, right, by definition, by its own term. And so what I ended up focusing on, which I think is highly relevant to mental health and clinical disorders, is exactly that dimension of how automaticity in thought arises and how it can become sometimes problematic, and how we can channel it to be more positive. And this relates to what John Dunn brought up yesterday in his introductory remarks about virtue and about how do we build into place in our brains and minds habits. And so habits to me are a very important way in which automatic constraints on thought occur. They're not the only ones, but they're very important. And so this is, I think, what lies at the basis of not just science and our understanding of mental health, but really a lot of our understanding of our society and how we can achieve potential ways to improve it. Because we really don't, first of all, understand how our own minds are automatically constrained and how our own thoughts are automatically constrained. But I think there is an even broader here issue of that urgently demands understanding, is how our society constrains our mental states. And so one of the arguments that I've been looking into recently that I'd like to make is that in fact, we live in a society that privileges some neurotransmitter systems of the brain and some networks, and underprivileges other, or actively shuts them down. And I'll say what I think they are. Living in a capitalist, industrialized, developed world, we are encouraged by virtue of our economies and social connectivity to want things, right? So we come up with needs and desires, and their satisfaction leads to more needs and desires, and that is built into our economic system. This is one of the great achievements of capitalism, is the creation of needs and desires. And so from the neuro perspective, I feel that what we're doing through that kind of social order is to lead to a constant release of dopamine in our brains. At the same time, what we are discouraging in our brains is the serotonergic transmission. And I think that is partly why people are so drawn to practices like meditation, psychedelics, and other ways in which we can increase our serotonin, because serotonin is all about connection. And you may have heard about oxytocin and how much it's important for connection. But oxytocin disconnects as it connects, because the way oxytocin connects us is in a way to form in-groups and out-groups. So as it makes us feel closer to our kin, it makes us feel more distant and sometimes aggressive to those that we perceive as outsiders to our groups. And what serotonin does is something very different. It's about a very different type of connection. And it's about, serotonin is one of the oldest chemicals in our brain, which we share with plants. So it first evolved in plants, and they use it for photosynthesis. And then we don't make it in our brains. We have to take it from plants. And what it does is it creates this very primal state in which we feel connected, not just to other human beings, but actually to other living beings, right? So this is where ego dissolution comes in very systematically as a finding on psychedelic administration. People feel one with the tree that they're under, or one with the world. And so that connectivity does not have a component of exclusion in it, which oxytocin does. And so one of the things that I think it's important to understand, how we've built our society in ways that specifically suppress some of our human brain abilities and pathologically enhance others, and therefore create an imbalance of dynamics in the brain, which then goes back to mental health. Because if we evolved to have a certain variety of brain system and brain networks and brain neurotransmitters, and now we're taking away that diversity in our brains, it will inevitably lead to mental health issues and ultimately dissatisfaction and unhappiness. And so this is something that we really need to understand and address as a society.
Wow.
Wow.
Thank you.
Kalina.
And Wendy, thank you so much. You know, I'd like to just invite Richie for a few moments to comment, and then we'll conclude this fascinating session.
Thank you, Roshi, and thank you, Kalina. This was just a breathtaking review, and I want to just express my deepest appreciation for your work and how much it has really helped us to better understand what's going on. I want to sort of ask two very brief questions, and in the process just make a comment about it. One is the issue of contrasting the internal and external sources of experience in your framework, and the external you describe as sensory and the internal as conceptual. And the question is really about non-conceptual internal experience. One of the things that the Dalai Lama asks us about almost every time we see him is, what are the neural correlates of non-conceptual mental activity? And so the focus on the medial temporal lobe, I think, is very interesting and probably quite specific to conceptual
internal sources of experience, but there may well be a diverse set of other sources of internal experience that are non-conceptual. So that's just an issue to potentially comment on. The other is, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this as we go along, is the issue of the potential deleterious impact of meta-awareness. Here's my brief view on this. I think that there may be a potential deleterious impact of meta-awareness in the early stages of cultivating meta-awareness. But when meta-awareness becomes the normal operating mode of the mind, as a consequence of very, very long-term practice, I question whether it actually is deleterious ever. And so that's just a question for you and for the group. So thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for just a beautiful talk. Loved it.
Well, thank you, Richie, for doing everything that you do for this field and for making it exist. Because I think if it hadn't been for you, I would not have been able to publish and do what I've been able to do, because we didn't have a neuroscience of meditation and mindfulness before you were able to make it happen. So thank you for that.
Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you.
Yeah, so those are just beautiful questions, and the one about the non-conceptual sources is just fascinating, and I can't say that I have a ready answer other than to just share with you my hunch about the possibility that there could be sources of experience that are in some way linked to our physiology, that then percolate themselves into awareness, that are non-conceptual, that could be potentially conceptualized and turned into narrative. But before we do that, they're non-so. And I think those would be really interesting to explore. Those have been what I've been referring to a little bit as interoception. So we do know that a lot of the limbic structures of the brain and a lot of the subcortical, even brainstem structures and the parts of the brain that interface between the neural system and the endocrinology system, the hormonal system, those are the ones that signal to the brain, to some of the cortical structures, our physiological states. And I think those are some very important signaling that for most of our existence we ignore, and we in fact spend our life learning how not to pay attention to until at some point in our life we decide to meditate, and then we have to undo that learning of never paying attention to our breath or heartbeat and so forth. And so I think those potentially are a candidate non-conceptual sources of experience that we just haven't explored so far. And I'm starting just a study now that I'm really excited about, and I think that could be a very good line of research that might inform us about that. We're starting to look, and this is COVID-19 related, we're starting to look at resilience and burnout in healthcare practitioners. And what we'll be looking at is how these processes around stress and around physiological responses play themselves out. And the resilience to me is a very interesting phenomenon. And of course, burnout is a symptom of resilience failing. But it has something to do with this physiological response to stress and how we can load up our body and as a consequence, our neural system on stress. And then how that then, do we have the capacity to unload it? And a lot of it is what meditation helps us deal with. But I think meditation only deals with the very high level of that. And our body deals with a very big chunk of low level of that. And I think there's an interface between these two that may relate back to your idea for non-conceptual sources of experience that will be really interesting to study.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, and the other question about meta-awareness, I'm really curious to hear more about that, because I don't know that much about this intention of meditation to make meta-awareness habitual. I'm not a long-term practitioner, and I haven't followed these practices. So I'd be actually curious to hear back from all of you in terms of, is that something that's usually the aim of meditation, is to develop a continuous meta-awareness? It goes back to Jonathan Schooler's talk. Is it something that is the aim of meditation, or is the aim of meditation to achieve a more stable awareness overall over time? What are the aims and what are the desired outcomes in terms of meta-awareness and awareness?
I think this will be a great question to come back to tomorrow with Buddhist scholars participating and practitioners as well.
Mm-hmm.
Kalina, thank you. And Richie, thank you so much. We are going to conclude this session in just a few moments. Just to remind you, we will convene at 5:30 Mountain Time for meditation. Hopefully not much rumination. I wonder about meta-awareness and shikantaza. Maybe Jay can opine on this subject later. Then at 7 o'clock Pacific time, 8 o'clock Mountain Time, we'll join Jonathan and his partner in a sound experience. I'm sure it will be very interesting. And the link to that is actually at the bottom of the communication that you all received this morning. So please look for that link. And then tomorrow morning is very rich. After our 7 a.m. meditation, we'll meet with Richie and our community here. Richie will begin with a guided meditation, and then we'll do a presentation on awareness and adversity. So this is very timely, Richie, not only the pandemic, but also the riots that are happening across this country. And looking at this subject from the point of view of Dharma and science in our time. And Alyssa Eppel will lead the moderation. And then later in the morning, John Dunn. To be conscious is to be unconsciously connected. And we're looking forward to John speaking about reflexivity and non-duality. In the afternoon, Al will do a summary of that. And then in the afternoon, all of us will come together. And Richie will do a guided meditation. And then Al will moderate a kind of community exchange between the presenters, but also involving the Maha community that's gathered for this remarkable time together. So again, Kalina, deepest thanks. And also, I want to offer special thanks to the translators, particularly Maria Ho and the other translator in Spain, where it's later than midnight or something like that. This is a great gift on their part to us, and also to our two teams in Spain and Brazil, who are helping to bring this to so many people who are non-English speakers. So deep gratitude, and to you, Wendy, for your wonderful questions. We'll see you at 5:30. Bye-bye.